Good morning, whoever might be watching. Just waiting for David Martin to get in. He said he'll be here around 11:15, and then we'll start. And I'm gonna let you in on the pre-show banter that we do. I gotta get in the. I gotta wake up. What am I looking for? Oh yes. Why is it doing this? Okay, there we go. Now I can read the chat on my phone. Oh, God almighty. All right. How y'all doing? There's a few of you in there now. Are you doing well? All right, this too many angles of me. So let's move into that. Okay. So I'm waiting on David Martin to come in, as I said. And we're going to talk today about the Battle of Gettysburg. Is it truly the turning point of the war? And we've got graphs and a diary entry or a letter here, diary entry. I have again escaped unhurt, though through most desperate battle of the war. I assure you that I thank God for it. We spent July 4th standing in the rain, in great suspense as to our next move. Now laying in battle. I think we have with him even as my health is good. I feel unpleasant on account of having being short in 24 days. I suppose that accounts for the itching sensation I have. Ugh, how horrible. I suppose you have heard of our corps. Lost 4,900 of 10,000 killed. Wounded and missing. This is very heavy. Blah, blah, blah. 6 New Jersey. That's 3rd Corps. All right. Well, looks like he had fun here at Gettysburg.
Okay, Matt, you got me?
Yeah. How you doing, David?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Let me just.
Okay, I owe apologies. I was going to do this. I have a new office over in the alumni building, and I was all set up to do this podcast. And I turned the computer on, and there's no camera on it.
Oh, really?
So I had to go scare up an office where I can get a camera.
Now, can you lower the camera though? Because I only see the top of your head. There you go. There you go.
Oh, there we are. Okay.
Yeah, there we are. All right.
Okay,
good. Now I can see
you again. Just give me a high sign when we start recording. You're looking for what, between 60 and 90 minutes, and you'll edit back, or what?
Yeah, I usually don't really edit unless there's like a big gap where somebody loses their train of thought or something. So we'll do, I usually shoot for 60. Often it goes to 90. Let the conversation go where it will. Sometimes it goes under.
I'm delighted to be doing this. It's hit my mind this summer that I usually do 1 or 2 in the summer, and I didn't get around to it. I have heard good things about your whole addressing Gettysburg business in the podcast, especially friends of mine that have heard snippets of it and then go in and sign up for the whole thing.
Oh, good.
And there's a little surge in some of my book sales actually after you broadcast.
I'm glad to hear that. That's the whole idea. So I'm glad that's working for you. All right, let me just do something here.
So you got the handouts. I'll explain in the course of the conversation. I did this for an APUS class. Analyzing inflation rates during the war.
Okay.
And it's original research I haven't had published yet, but it's at this stage. If somebody else wants to pick it up, that's fine.
Right.
But and I actually, and I'll probably mention in the talk also, I gave this last week to a roundtable because I hadn't done this talk in 10 years, and it went very well last week at the roundtable. And people thank me for looking at the war at different angles than military.
Yeah. Yeah, I've been kind of drifting that way too lately. You know, the military stuff is obviously interesting and important because it's the war, and that's why we're interested in that time period. But when you talk about casualties and maiming and death day in and day out, it kind of gets depressing. So you want to kind of explore the rest of society at that time. And so this would be, so now what, so just worry. So we're asking the question, was Gettysburg truly the turning point of the war, right?
Yep. And I will mention, as I taught the U.S. history classes, there's differences between sparks and multiple causation. And there are different areas of historical action besides military, economic, psychological, political. And I'm going to look at the turning points in each one of those. And what is decisive for me is looking at those inflation rates till the conflation of all the areas of activity is fall 64.
Okay.
As a turning point. But
Okay.
I'm going to argue also for spring 62, and at least to get people thinking.
All right.
And then we'll also have a good discussion on why then is Gettysburg thought to be the turning point. And I have some theories on that to share, and you probably will also. So
Okay, good. All right, well then let's get it started then.
okay.
Here we go. Oops, wait. Oh, do you have something playing in the background?
There's a refrigerator on. You're catching a buzz from that?
No, it sounds like voices. Hold on. Oh, it's me. Oh, I did it. It's me. I had my.
I do have. There's a French class next door here.
No. I'm monitoring the show on my phone, and I didn't turn the volume down. Okay, so now let's get started here.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening.
Also, just to
to
alert you, I have
Addressing
my
Gettysburg.
puppy with me, and if she might bark, or I might have to dart up to get her. But I think she's happy. She'll fall asleep at my feet eventually.
That's fine. That would be a nice addition, I think.
A nice humid addition.
Yeah. All right.
From the Gettysburg Museum of History Studios, you're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special Patreon episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we have our friend David Martin back, and we are talking about, we're going to explore the question, was the Battle of Gettysburg truly the turning point of the war? And then we'll also get into why it's seen as the turning point of the war. This is a question that I've noticed on social media in the last 5 or 6 years since I started doing the show. There seems to be people making a point to say, it's not really the turning point of the war. Sometimes I think those people are just trying to be contrarian because they don't really back it up with anything. But we all know that David backs things up. So we're going to get into that right now with David. David, welcome back to Addressing Gettysburg.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'm delighted to be here.
So, all right, where this was a class you taught?
Okay, well,
Or part of a class.
The genesis of this was I used to 20 years ago do a guest lecture for I teach at a private high school for the AP advanced placement classes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd go in and show them my reenactor weapons and that until they didn't allow weapons to grow out on school campuses anymore.
Right.
And start talking about Gettysburg and the war in general. And then I started doing some original research on my own, looking into the inflation rates during the war. And the inflation rates are a psychological economic impact of what's going on. And when you look at the inflation rates during the war, and I'll explain those in a while, Gettysburg's not economically the turning point of the war.
Right.
It may be a military turning point, but there are other areas of human activity that we look at in history classes, psychological, economic, clearly military, political. There's also religious can figure in, but we're not dealing with the Crusades or something like that. So
Right.
you want to look at each of the historical spheres and see where those turning points might be, and then see where Gettysburg fits into that. Now, also we discuss a couple aspects in high school that are good for us as Civil War historians to look at. One is the difference between a spark and a cause. We all know that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo started World War I, but that wasn't the cause of World War I.
Sure.
The ultimate cause may have been the alliance system.
Okay.
People argue that the cause of World War II was the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I.
Mhm.
So to look at different sparks and causes doesn't affect us here, but what may affect us is multiple causation. Rarely does anything in human activity come from one cause. There's usually one with 2 or 3 secondaries. If you get into 5 or 6, you're shotgunning, and you need to evaluate those.
Right.
And what may come back down to, and I guess shoot my wad early on this, does there have to be a turning point? Now, I've heard it argued, and it might have been from Jim McPherson at a talk I heard to the professor from Princeton, that every battle almost is a turning point, except for maybe Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, because they kind of run together. Almost every battle is a turning point because you go a slightly different direction.
Mm.
When we discuss turning point for purposes of this conversation, it's a major turning point. Is that where everything that was one way now goes another way? So I'm not a proponent of multiple turning points.
Okay.
In that way, every battle is one, but I do want to look at, as the preface for this, the different major spheres of activity: military, political, economic, and psychological, and see if they have turning points or if they all come together maybe at Gettysburg. And we'll see where the talk goes.
So what would you say then would be the first, let's say, military turning point of the war?
Okay. When I'm in the mood, I argue, and I guess before we get going into that, if you were a Union soldier at Warrenton, Virginia, in August of 1863,
Mm-hmm.
are you sitting in your camp saying, "Yay, the war just turned.
Mm-mm.
I am so happy"?
No.
The war is grinding on for both sides. I sent you a quote there from a soldier in the 6th New Jersey.
Yeah.
A letter to Mom: "I'm glad I survived through this battle." It's from Gettysburg, July 5th. "I suppose you have heard that our Corps lost 4,900 of 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing. That is very heavy. I hope the enemy will at once go back to Virginia, i.e. where they belong."
Yeah.
A typical Confederate soldier, is he going to argue the war is half over? No. "Dear Mom, we fought a big battle but couldn't take their position. It was full of cannons and rocks. We went home with tons of captured supplies and horses and mules. It rained. Johnny and Billy from Clark County are missing. Cousin Jamie got killed." Okay, if you're a soldier in the trenches, you're not seeing Gettysburg as the turn.
Right.
Early in the war, now this is also taking aside the blockade. Now, you might say the turning point of the war was not when they decreed the blockade, but when the blockade became effective. But in order for the blockade to become effective, you have to take New Orleans, Mobile, which didn't fall till 65, Fort Fisher, which fell late. But the physical blockade is a telling point and an important factor in the Union victory, but not the determinant. Could they have won the war? North won the war without the blockade? Probably. And I'll circle back to your question about early in the war, but I used to do game designing. Some people may know me from the game design world. And when you're taught it in the battle attacks that in order for an attacker or the aggressor to win, they need odds of 3 to 1. So I went through all the soldier enlistments during the war, and in 1861, the North had an advantage of 200,000 to 120. That's only 5 to 3.
Mm-hmm.
By 1863, it's 900,000 to 450, 2 to 1. After 1863, Confederate numbers go down because they're running out of men, and the North quit trading prisoners. Northern troops will go up because if you've seen Gangs of New York, they're pulling the Irish troops off the boat and putting them in the army, and
Right.
B, the black troops. So finally, in 1865, you get a northern rate of 1,150,000, the South 350. There's your 3 to 1 odds. They don't have it till 65.
Okay. Right. So they got to work to that.
Soldier-wise, number of troops doesn't peak or turn until 1865, which is a lot different than July 63. So I just want to get that on the table as one aspect of military which is sheer number of troops in the field.
Okay.
Now, to address your original question, I don't know. I waffle back and forth. In 62, to me, that is the economic turning point of the war because two things happened. One, the North captured New Orleans. New Orleans is the only major city in the South that has a huge population. I have a list here of the 100 largest cities in 1860. Number one is New York, which isn't even a million yet. 2 is Philadelphia. 3 is Brooklyn, because that was a separate city in the 1890s. 4, Baltimore, which is under Union occupation. 5, Boston. 6, New Orleans, 168,000. New Orleans was not just the 6th biggest city in the country, it was the South's economic center, their financial center. And the capture of New Orleans, I actually heard, and I can't remember, somebody mentioned this at the talk I gave last week, but I didn't get the source, that the capture of New Orleans was the turning point of the war. Because once the South lost control of their banking system, that went. But what also happened in spring 62 is the North troops coming in from Ohio captured Nashville. And Nashville was the South's production center.
Okay.
Where all the manufacturing was.
Yeah.
And a short while later, I forget it was before or after Shiloh, Memphis fell. So if we argue that the South lost the war economically, yes, they have less railroad tracks and engines. Their main product is agricultural, which is cotton, which was the biggest exporting in the country. We bought a lot of money in. And the South actually blew that. I don't know if you ran across that they had a chance before the blockade became effective to ship a lot of cotton over to England and trade that in for guns and cannons to come back. But they had a voluntary embargo, which wasn't smart. And then England, somebody asked me, why didn't England come in on the war? Just as in the Revolution, we won the Revolution literally because the French came over to help us.
Right.
England didn't come in the war. They found better cotton in England, in India, and Egypt.
Okay, all right.
Which put the South out of business after the war. And that's how the South switched over to tobacco, I think, or vice versa.
So it sounds like in many ways, like the South kind of, I mean, they wouldn't have thought this at the time, but they lost before it began in many ways.
Right. If they were going to win, they had to do it early, kind of like the Mets playing the Phillies, which is hated, but they're in the playoffs right now.
Right.
You got to have a plan. And if you're going to get a lead early, that's when to do it. And yes, because they were more outdoorsy, they were used to riding horses. Their generals were better until they started shooting their own generals later in the war. And eventually they got worn down. The South was not equipped for a long-range war, and they would have had to win early. So there's a big economic issue that isn't cojoined a lot, that in spring 62, when the South lost New Orleans, Nashville, and Memphis, their economic back was broken. Atlanta will become important then. It's also a railroad junction going east to west. And then Richmond picks up with the Tredegar Iron Works and a lot of manufacturing there. And I've been thinking, and maybe for a future podcast, to do some what ifs.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the what ifs to talk about, not just with Gettysburg, and I have some great ideas on, if Stonewall Jackson had been there and things that didn't happen.
Right.
What if the South did not move their capital from Montgomery to Richmond? How would the war have gone? What would have happened if the South actually did win, or England came in and negotiated a peace? So that might be interesting for another podcast down the line.
Okay, yeah, that'd be fun.
Stray away from the straight military history, and I'm maybe one of the worst offenders on that. Because as you know, I did along with John Busey, Regimental Strengths and Losses at Gettysburg, which is now, dang it, I think 40 years old.
Wow. And
is still selling.
Yeah, good.
And which was because when you ask why are we interested in the Civil War, I'm a little bit older generation than you are. I'm 75. But when I was a young teenager, was the centennial. And that's what was all over the place. So I got to like Gettysburg. And then, of course, my second favorite's Antietam. And I used to recreate the battles with toy soldiers. In order to do that, I need to make orders of battle. And I had one toy soldier for every 100 that was in the battle. So I want to know how many men they had. And
Okay.
that I started researching way back then. I did research for the game Terrible Swiss Sword that Rich Berg did, and it eventually became this, um, modestly say, seminal book on Army organization and strengths at Gettysburg based on the muster rolls, because there was a payroll on June 30th.
Right.
And you
Okay.
can see actually what companies were there, what companies were detached, where they were. And they said, even Coddington said, I think, that Confederate records aren't there. And John Busey and I researched, there's about 40% of the Confederate muster rolls were there. You had to count
Huh.
them up company by company. And from there, you can extrapolate through the rest of the units, and that all the process is explained in the book. And still 40 years later, that is the source book, even though some people have pirated it. Sometimes the information, most nicely or legally. But anyway, I'm digressing there. That I've been fascinated with Gettysburg, and this will circle back to why it's thought to be turning point of the war.
Okay.
So what we're talking is economic impact. Now, I guess I might as well, if you want, if we can, lapse into that. How is it Gettysburg comes to be thought to be the turning point? I twice in the last week have heard on TV, we all know Gettysburg was the turning point of the war.
Right.
Well, okay. The victory was sort of on July 4th, and they link it with Vicksburg,
Mm-hmm.
which is July 4th. Now, if you look back at Vicksburg, did the capture of Vicksburg seal the Mississippi, fate of the Mississippi? No. The North owns St. Louis all through the war, even though Missouri is mostly pro-Confederate. So St. Louis is up there in Northern hands. Spring 62, New Orleans is in Union hands. Nobody's doing Mississippi up and down the river trade anymore. Yes, Vicksburg fell on July 4th, 1863, but you know your history. The Mississippi wasn't completely controlled until Port Hudson fell a few weeks later.
Okay.
But my question is that I bring up, how much actual trade was going back and forth between Texas and Mississippi? Not much. There's a few Texas units in Lee's army, Great Brigade, what's Texas Brigade. They got a lot of cows out there, but nothing significant happened in Texas. I'm sure people will argue with that. So I don't think that closing the Mississippi by the capture, and even though Vicksburg wasn't the final closing of the Mississippi, Port Hudson was, that closing the Mississippi in 63 was very significant, because the war has switched to the east. And I think you might be an argument, the war was lost when Tennessee fell. Because when Tennessee fell, there was no chance the South was going to get those border states, which did have pro-Union and pro-Confederate governments. There was a lot of campaigning back and forth in Kentucky and Missouri, and there was even one invasion went up into Ohio. And then Maryland was never on the verge of seceding, because Lincoln illegally arrested all the pro-Confederate leaders and threw them into Fort McHenry. And somebody said, well, what about Delaware? Well, Delaware wasn't going to go Confederate because the DuPont family was loyal to the Union, and they had all the gunpowder contracts.
Okay.
So Delaware wasn't about to secede. So what I was arguing is, once that New Orleans, Memphis, and Nashville are gone, and Tennessee is pretty much secured, despite Chickamauga, which I just see as an aberration. And that was one of the 2 or 3 good Confederate uses of the railroad. The first one was when they got Jackson and his buddies from the Shenandoah Valley to First Bull Run, and surprised McDowell. He would have won if Jackson hadn't been there. They just weren't up to speed on what troops were able to do. And then in this fall of 63, both sides were shipping troops out to Tennessee, out to Chattanooga. So I'm arguing then that Vicksburg ain't the turning point, because I don't think it turned anything. It's in the middle of the war, which is significant, and that also affects Gettysburg. 61 to 65, 63 is the middle, and that's a good place to have a turning point. In the middle.
But would you say that Vicksburg combined with Gettysburg makes July of 63 a turning point month?
Okay, that will be happening, and I'll look next at what's going on with Gettysburg. In the national view, the northern newspapers went bogats over all that, all the news from the west, all the good news from the east, and yay, we're finally not losing. And there's a difference between not losing and winning.
Yeah.
Talk to the Giants, New York Giants. So what happened that made Gettysburg seem important? Um, yes, it's one we won, but it's not the only southern invasion we turned back. We turned them back at Antietam. Okay, we turned them back the next year. Early was at Fort Stevens, shooting at Washington, shooting at President Lincoln, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
There's only been 2 American presidents that've been on real battlefields. And you know Lincoln at Fort Stevens when he's there on the parapet with his stovepipe hat and I think it was a captain, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, "Get down, you fool."
Yeah.
You know who the other president under fire was?
He was a president on a battlefield while serving as president?
Yep.
While serving as president.
It's not like Wilson or FDR going over to Europe.
Yeah. Well, I was going to
sorry
say...
to surprise you with that. But yeah.
Well, no, the only... I'm thinking Washington led troops in the Whiskey Rebellion, but I don't know if a shot was fired.
Actually, I think... Was it...
Oh, was it?
Knox? I mean, one of his assistants was out there, either Knox or Wayne or somebody. Anyway, what I'm looking for is James Madison at the Battle of Bladensburg before Washington got burned. Because in this country, we don't like to remember that Washington got burned. And that's why the White House was white. Because after it got burned, they had to paint it again.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he was the losing general. Dolly was moving Washington's mementos out of the White House.
It's funny you said that because I almost said Monroe. And I said, no, it's not Monroe. Yeah. His wife... The guy I'm thinking of, his wife is the ice cream lady, and then you said it.
See, good for you. I'll give you credit for that.
No, I can't take that.
So what's happening at Gettysburg? Yes, we won. It wasn't the only Southern invasion we turned back.
Yeah.
And I guess you want to argue Antietam's the turning point because of the slavery.
Well, I've heard, I've heard some people say that Antietam was a turning point. Yeah. That there's many turning points.
Yeah. What happens if you're going to declare a turning point? And I don't even know I can argue it's a military turning point. We'll get to that shortly also. But after the war, the Northern troops, veterans, were coming back to Gettysburg for their reunions, and they started putting up all their regimental monuments. Okay. Because we won that one. And it's closest to the north, and it's got a railroad to it.
Sure.
So in the 1870s, all the Northern veterans are coming back to Gettysburg for their reunions to celebrate we won the war. And in the process, they're having Gettysburg also become the turning point. Because in their mind, it's north. That's not the farthest north he went because he got up almost to Harrisburg. The veterans are all camping there. And as I teach in the history class, or I give tours at Monmouth Battlefield because it's close to where I live in New Jersey, in history, sometimes it's not what happened that counts, it's what you think happened. The Battle of Monmouth was technically a draw in every way. After the battle, General Washington's staff, including Alexander Hamilton, and I'm actually giving a talk on him next week over at the battlefield, wrote the official report like we won.
Okay.
Because we had the battlefield afterwards and the British weren't there anymore. And they went through 3 versions of the official report. Each one had more British casualties and less Confederate. So the country viewed Monmouth as a victory because of the way it was presented.
Okay. Yeah.
To the history books. So sometimes it's not so much what happened, it's what is presented or what you think happened.
So in other words, the veterans coming back here saying, in hindsight, now that the war is encapsulated from beginning to end in their minds, after Gettysburg, not immediately, but they can trace things getting better.
The immediate post-war era. And I haven't done the ground research on that, and it might be worth somebody's master's or PhD thesis to look in the history books to see exactly when Gettysburg starts appearing as the turning point. Because I don't think it was during the war for the reason I'm going to show you right now.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, so in the national mentality in the 1870s, Gettysburg plus July 4 plus Vicksburg, although July 4 was just a coincidence and Vicksburg, as I just argued, wasn't that important, but it did happen at the same time. So why am I saying we'll look now at the military turning point? Now, I sent to you a copy of a chart I made, and I'm sorry the audience can't be able to see this, but this builds from back when I was a kid. My favorite team was the Detroit Tigers. And when Al Kaline was playing there, he was my hero way back then. I wanted to write on the wall down in the basement. Every time Detroit won a game, I'd make my graph go up one. They lose a game, it goes down one. And I tried that for 2 straight summers, and it was too long for a 14-year-old to keep my attention span over a 5-month or whatever it is baseball season. But I did go through this mapping out the Civil War on a chart.
Which chart are we looking at here?
This is page 3.
So page 3. Okay, got it.
Okay, and just for the audience, what's going on is I started the North at 0, and they lost the first bull run, so you go down 1. You lose at Fort Sumter, you go down 2 if you had before then. You lost at Ball's Bluff, you're now at -3 on keeping track of a battle won is a plus and the battle lost is a minus. You don't start winning anything until Nashville and New Orleans, and that gets you back up to 0. But then you start on a bad trend with the Shenandoah Valley campaign, the 7 Days campaign, second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, and it bottoms out down at Chancellorsville in early '63.
Yeah.
Now, after Chancellorsville, I mean, this is the +1, -1. It bottoms out at -5 of the battles I'm counting at Chancellorsville in the spring of '63. But you could then maybe say Chancellorsville is a turning point because we won, I was going to say most all the battles after, but we didn't. You have Gettysburg victory, Vicksburg as wins, but then you have Chickamauga.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're starting to feel good about yourselves because you get up to Knoxville, which we don't talk about much, and General Longstreet didn't talk about much either for obvious reasons. He failed in independent command. But then you get to spring '64, and I don't know what, I think it's usually counted in the history books. The North lost Wilderness, and Spotsylvania was a draw.
Mm.
And then you get to Cold Harbor.
Mm.
And that's another nadir. That's another minus swing. And the chart doesn't go up continually till Atlanta, summer '64.
Yeah.
And after Atlanta, and you can see there from the chart, we got Savannah. We recaptured Nashville, Petersburg, Richmond, Appomattox. The chart goes way up off the map. So if you're going to argue for the military turning point where everything afterwards was won, it's with Atlanta.
Yeah.
And that's '64.
Yeah, it's much later than Gettysburg.
Because they're still going up and down, going back to how does that Union soldier camped at Warrenton, Virginia in August '63 say, geez, I'm glad the war just turned.
Mm-hmm.
No, they're still fighting back and forth. And the nadir, and we'll look at this when I look at the inflation rates, is spring '64. Now, what else ties into '64? Political. What is the political turning point of the war? Damn it, it's the '64 presidential election.
Yeah.
Lincoln had a letter ready for his successor, beloved General McClellan, to give him support. But that's very important, because if that election had gone the wrong way, the war could have ended then. Now, Lincoln is a good politician. We always think of him as Mr. Cool, Mr. Nice Guy. But if you saw the movie Lincoln, when he was trying to get the 13th Amendment passed, he could use bribes right and left along with the backbone.
Yeah.
Okay. And one little trick he made to win that election that's not much recognized is he got the soldiers to be allowed to do absentee ballots. And surprisingly, the Union soldiers voted Republican to keep the war going.
Yeah.
Rather than for their General McClellan.
Yeah.
Now, not that McClellan was the most popular guy around. He's running as a war Democrat. I am not anti-McClellan. A lot of people are. In that people don't account for when he was in the Peninsula Campaign, he faced the biggest Confederate army they ever had in one spot. Lee had almost 100,000 men.
Yeah.
At Richmond. And McClellan had a great idea to come up the peninsula because he had 2 rivers for bringing supplies. He had a railroad. And when he stalled out there, Lincoln had a moment of weakness and recalled him because it took 2 more years of war for Grant to get back to the same place. Cold Harbor is right next to Gaines's Mill from '62. It took him 2 more years of fighting. Lincoln should have let him stay there. But Lincoln went indecisive, and then everybody started getting sick in the camps. And they called the campaign off and recalled him. And in the process, Lee jumped on Pope its Second Bull Run, and the whole war has several chapters to it.
Yeah.
So McClellan wasn't that bad a guy as a planner. I'll tell an anecdote here. 20, 30, no, it must have been 30 years ago or more. A friend of mine was going to start up a General McClellan Society. New Jersey loved him. New Jersey was Democratic. Sure. New Jersey is the only state that cast electoral votes against Lincoln in both 1860 and 64 because they were conservative.
So I say New Jersey's always on the wrong side of history.
Yep. So McClellan, who was from Philadelphia, comes back to become governor of New Jersey. So my friend was going to start a McClellan Society down in Trenton. And I thought that was a great idea. I couldn't go that night. I had to work. So I called him the next day and said, okay, how'd your meeting go? And he says, nobody came.
Really?
Yeah. So when I give a talk on New Jersey generals in the war, the good, the bad, and the ugly, McClellan's in the top 5, but he's also in the bottom 5.
Okay.
Depends on how you look at it. So anyway, I circle back around that politically, the turning point is the 1864 presidential election, which is fall 64. And what assured Lincoln that victory was, as I said, he was allowing the soldiers to cast absentee ballots. But remember that telegram that Sherman sent to Lincoln after he captured Savannah? Sir, I give to you as a Christmas present the city of Savannah.
Yeah.
So it was Sherman's victory after Atlanta because the capture of Savannah was after the election.
Right.
But I think then Atlanta, which we just looked at as a possible military turning point, might also have caused or guaranteed the political turning point, which was Lincoln's re-election. Because if the war was still going badly and the northern newspapers were full of casualty lists and ready to shoot Grant, the war just was not going well in the summer of 64, as they hoped. And they didn't, and partly because they didn't have that 3-to-1 manpower edge that I talked about earlier. Yes, the war was being won in the West. Yes, the blockade was becoming effective. So what I'm looking at there is political turning point, November 64. Military turning point, if not Gettysburg, would be Atlanta. Economic turning point, spring 62.
Okay.
Okay, and so that's 3 different options to Gettysburg in summer 63. Now, the real original research that I did was to look into the inflation rates.
Right. Let's get into that because that's
inflation rates is how strong your economy is working, and also what confidence the people have in their government. Now, one thing you have to look at is in the economic side of the war, how did each side finance the war? Okay, the South, on their dollar bills, I used to have a large collection of it, but I disposed of it. But on their pretty Confederate bills that they later said weren't worth the paper they were printed on, but I think they're worth more than Continental dollars, at least as collector's items.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until the 1960s probably that they started to be worth more than their face value as collector's items. But on those Confederate bills, it said, it was a $50 bill, $50 redeemable in either cotton or something, 2 years after the ratification of a peace treaty between the United States and the Confederate States. So those dollars are only good if we win.
If we win.
And then only 2 years later. They're promissory notes.
Yeah. And then that could be a decade away. You don't know how long that war is going to last.
So the South had trouble financing their war, especially after New Orleans fell as their national center and the blockade started cutting off the cotton, and more so the supplies coming the other way. How did the North finance the war? So I remember when I was younger, I don't know if you do, dollar bills, in my dad's time, you could redeem them for gold.
Right.
Okay. FDR did that away. In our day, the dollar bill said redeemable for $1 in silver till around.
So yeah, that was before my time as well. By my time, we went off the gold and silver standard.
Yeah, and you know what it says on the dollar bills now? In God we trust.
Okay. So in other words, we trust that God is going to make this valuable.
Yeah, the reason those dollar bills are worth something is they can be used to pay taxes. And that becomes then the basis of the government. But there's no hard currency backing up dollar bills anymore.
Right.
Greenbacks started with the Civil War. That's how Lincoln financed the war. He put in $450 million of greenbacks issued by 1864, which are promissory notes, and they did redeem them afterwards. And then you get into the William Jennings Bryan, "You shall not crucify the country in a cross of gold. Should we use silver or gold as our standard?" But both sides had trouble financing the war. The North had a better way of doing it because they had the economic power to work with it. So both sides are suffering from very bad inflation. Now, fortunately, it wasn't as bad as like living in Brazil 20 years ago, where you had to go cash your paycheck. I don't know what it's like down there now.
Right.
It's
Right.
hard to single Brazil out, but if you get get paid, you got to go cash your check before it's worth half of that. I remember when I was young, I worked at McDonald's. You get change for your dollar. Actually, you get a hamburger for 15 cents, fries for 15 cents, a drink for 10, and so you can get a whole meal for like 32 cents, including tax.
Wow.
And I compare now, what's a hamburger cost now? I think a little more than 15 cents because we're having inflation. And this is since 1968.
Right. Right.
50 years. So I went and got a list of the inflation rates. And figure out where I put that there. The inflation rate in the North in 1861 was 6%. This is page 5 on what I sent you. Was 6%, which is what we accept as normal these days.
Okay.
1862, their inflation rate is 14.2% because there's more currency in circulation. 1863, it's 25%.
This is the North.
This is the North.
Wow.
You'd think because they're winning the war, the rate would have gone down.
Right.
Where does it peak out? 25.2% in 1864. By 65, it's down to 4%. So the turning point inflation-wise is 1864. And what's interesting, after the war, there's a negative inflation rate for 20 years.
Yeah.
And the inflation rate don't catch up again until, behold, 1917. Why? Because we got to finance a war.
Right, right. So
in the North, and I'm calling inflation a combination of economic status, but also the psychological belief in the government.
Yeah. So I don't know if you looked beyond 1900, but in the 20th century, did we ever have years or a year of negative inflation?
I do have those charts here. I'm trying to dig out where I put them. Nice question. And I don't know that I have them. Well, surely in the 30s during the Depression.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I've got the full chart here. Now, your question is 1917 to 1921, we're doing 15 to 20%. Okay, in the 30s, there's with the deflation going on, there was a negative 9% in 1931. The next peak is 1942, 11%. 1947, I don't know why it's 15, and then it settles down to an average of 1 to 2% until the oil crisis of the late 70s.
So that's a pretty good run.
Went up to 15. So when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, there was very little inflation. The country was humming. It was a good time to grow up, other than the threat of thermonuclear war.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to where we are.
Okay.
Talking about inflation now. We'll come back to Union in a moment. Annual Confederate inflation rates. I'm not quite sure where I got this chart from, but their inflation was bad enough at the beginning. It was 20% in 1861 when they're even winning the war, because they have no hard currency to back up their money. They only have all this cotton that they can't sell, which is why they're printing dollar or bills with promissory notes for 2 years afterwards. And even though these numbers are staggering, they're comparative. By end of 63, they're up to 130%, but it's been relatively stable, and people were still selling their goods and buying Confederate bonds. The Confederate inflation rate was high, peaked out early 64. It's 700%, which is just astounding. And I think that's got to do, I guess, with Knoxville, what's going on there. But then it dropped back down to 50% in late 64.
Now, why?
Because they're winning wilderness Spotsylvania, and they hope the war. Remember, I'm calling inflation rate a psychological view of economics.
Sure.
So their lowest inflation rate, other than late '61, was in '64. Now you see things are starting to conflate in '64. We got a military turning point in Atlanta. You got a political turning point with the election, and Confederate confidence in their government is strong in the summer or late summer of '64. By the end of the war, it's like 1,000%, but they're losing their way past redeeming.
So are you saying then that when people lose their faith in the government, they save their money instead of spend it? Or what causes the inflation? I mean, the
scarcity of goods versus monetary value and confidence in the government to be able to do what it does.
Okay.
So if I'm not confident, if we go to thermonuclear war with Iran, which I don't think we hope we don't do, McDonald's hamburgers might go up to $20.
Sure.
Because of supply chain problems.
Okay, gotcha.
And confidence in the dollar bill.
Gotcha.
Now, the union inflation rate, bearing in mind that inflation, I'm seeing as a psychological view of the economic situation, was growing steadily in 1862. It drops at the time of Gettysburg in summer '63, but union inflation rate jumped up to 185%, according to this chart, in spring or summer '64.
Still not as bad as those Confederates.
And if you look at, and I'm sorry again, your audience can't see this, if you look at the Confederate inflation rate versus Union inflation rate, they're diametrical. If the South is having less confidence, the North has more.
Right.
That's summer '63. The summer has great '64. The South has great confidence, and that's where the peak of the North is, because the North does not have confidence.
Yeah.
So if you're a citizen in the United States in '64, you're happy in the South, even though you've lost the West, but it looks like the war is going your way. And you're sad if you're in the North.
That's amazing to look at on that chart like that.
And that's sheer inflation, which I haven't seen. I'm sure there's historians have looked at this. And again, I built this as a presentation for our advanced placement U.S. history class to you see how original research outside the box can get you thinking differently.
Yeah.
So now so these are the areas that I wanted to look at, and I'll go back to the different areas of activity that I had mentioned at one point. Let me figure out where all my notes went. Well, okay, I guess I can recreate it off the top of my head. Okay, politically, are we in agreement? The turning point is the '64 presidential.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Economically, I still would argue for spring '62, that once Memphis and Nashville and New Orleans were gone. Psychologically is tied into the inflation rate, and that's summer '64 or Atlanta '64. Militarily, Atlanta's looking like the turning point to me. The only place where the North really has an advantage on this is geographically. Once they took over most of Tennessee and cut off the far west, and that's not an area I looked a lot at. The South was never going to win the war geographically.
No,
they didn't have enough troops to defend so long a border.
Yeah,
and that's an area of activity that needs to be looked at. I don't think it was. I mean, it was happening, and there's no one turning point or one strongest point for there. And the religious issue, again, we're not talking about. This isn't the Crusades. The social. Yes, there is social stuff going on with the impact of the black troops in '64, but again, that's not a great turning point. It is a turning point from the original point I made. If the North needs a 3-to-1 advantage, manpower-wise, to win, where are they getting that from? The black troops. Now, black troops were enlisting whether they were freed or not,
right?
But that did increase their participation. It was the freedom from the slavery and promises that did come true with the 14th and 15th Amendment of getting citizenship rights, although Lincoln had to fight his own party to make that happen. And I did an interesting paper in in high school on, if Lincoln had lived, you know, he would have had a heck of a problem getting Reconstruction through. Of course, it came through a lot worse than it did because of the assassination.
Mm.
But that's another, what if that, again, we could talk maybe another time.
So
So our original posit for today's discussion is Gettysburg, the turning point.
Right.
Now, you can subscribe to multiple turning points. There's no reason that, like when you go to work, every stoplight, every corner is a turning point.
Yeah.
And if you continue straight there instead of turning, you'll end up where you don't want to be. But I think that's overdoing it and oversimplifying. I know when I used to go traveling in Europe, I would think, okay, I'm up in Edinburgh, Scotland. This is my turning point. I'm now going back to London
Okay.
because it's the farthest point of the trip.
Right.
If you look at that, I don't know. I guess that might help Gettysburg get going. Okay, so we have, according to my thinking, and I'll be glad to hear yours, or if you swayed you. It's interesting. Before this talk, I gave at a roundtable last week. 25% of, I polled them before I gave the talk. 25% thought Gettysburg was the turning point, and the other 75% thought maybe. At the end of the talk, nobody thought Gettysburg was the turning point. 40% thought maybe, and 60% thought, I think there's other things going on here.
That's interesting.
Because I'm getting.
Yeah. Now, do you think that's because of? I would say, at least let's go back. I'll put it at the assassination of JFK. From that moment on, it seems that the American public has grown increasingly skeptical of information coming out from all of our government institutions and then eventually the educational institutions, the academia. And now they're more willing to hear something other than what they've been taught, because we just kind of have this belief that everything we've been told, everything we've been taught has been bunk. And so we're willing to listen and we're willing to reconsider things. And that's probably why you didn't find much resistance in getting people to.
That's interesting. We won the war, and Gettysburg's close to home, and we celebrate the war at Gettysburg. And despite the Ku Klux Klan and whatnot, I mean, Joe Wheeler did become a Union general in the Spanish-American War.
Right.
And the United States flexed its muscle in both World War I and World War II, and they generally accepted government better than now, especially with the Warren Commission report.
Right.
Although nasty things were going on, it wasn't broadcast.
That's the thing we didn't know. Yeah.
If we had CNN during the Civil War would have ended in the summer of '62.
Oh my God. If we had social media from the beginning, I don't know if we ever would have been a country.
Yeah. Right.
So
just you're saying skepticism is healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Conspiracy theories, I don't know. I mean, there's still people who say we never landed on the moon.
It's funny you say that. I watched a documentary about that, and they were talking about what the conspiracy theorists claim, and then they give the rational scientific answer to refute it. But it's like, how would someone who's never been on the moon know how things are supposed to react on the moon? No one's ever experienced weightlessness except for so to say that the flag wouldn't move that way or whatever, like, how do you know? I don't know. I was never on the moon. So I don't know. That's beside the point. But I think talking to my father, he's in his 70s. He puts this all back at JFK, and that's why I went to JFK, because I agree with him. It seems that the attitude of the country prior to JFK was, or at least prior to the Warren Commission report, I should say, was, well, why would my government lie? We have the most wholesome government on the planet. We're about the people and this and that and the other thing. And then the Warren Commission comes out and people start poking holes in it. And the average person goes, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then you have the Vietnam War that is intensifying by the end of the 60s, and people are disillusioned with that. and people are starting to really kind of turn on their government. And I don't know, like, so I wasn't alive then. I was born in 78. I became aware of all that stuff in the 90s. And, I had a problem questioning. I thought the conspiracy theories were nuts before I thought they were probably true. And then I thought they were nuts again. And I guess it's like you live in the country, you pay attention to what goes on, you listen to what they say on one day, and if you have a long enough memory, a year later, 2 years later, they'll say something completely opposite, which happens to be the truth about the same thing they said on that one day. And it's like, how many times can I catch them in a lie before I don't believe a word they say? So I think someone, going into a class or a seminar and hearing someone lay out the case that Gettysburg was not the turning point, their mind is already open, because they're like, yeah, nothing I have ever believed has turned out to be true. So why not give this a shot?
Yeah, interesting. Somebody said, democracy is an imperfect form of government, but it's a hell of a lot better than whatever else is out there.
Right.
If we had known that Mrs. Wilson was running the country after he had his stroke, if we had known that FDR was as sick as he was, he never would have got elected the fourth time.
Yep.
Those things are happen, and you just need to be alert enough that what's you're being told, either by CNN or any other network, is cleansed or biased, and try to make your own decision, which circles back to me working with the AP US history class. You can believe Gettysburg was the turning point. Support it. Say what facts or thoughts are making you support that, and you could probably make a good argument that it was. What I'm throwing at the group today is having you think maybe Gettysburg wasn't. If it wasn't, what was? And this is the information. So you can have your own conclusion, just back it up with facts, thought, and argument. And I may have to end up with more, not every battle was a turning point, but multiple turning points.
Yeah.
Economically, the war turned in 62. Militarily, Gettysburg was a function of it, but I can't dodge that. Everything conflated in 64. Atlanta for battles and the election, the inflation rates, and then the manpower issue.
What about, how about the argument? Go ahead.
It depends on how you define your terms. That's also
yeah. So what about the argument that Gettysburg was the turning point because it was the last time the Army of Northern Virginia would be able to invade the North? They didn't after that.
Talk to Battle of Monocacy.
I mean, the North, not a border state that couldn't make up its mind.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it was the furthest north that they had gotten, and they had been pushed back.
Well, Perryville got a bit farther north, but that was kind of doomed when it started.
I'm talking in the Eastern Theater. Yeah.
I mean, that does make sense that the Confederates were kept back to Virginia basically after Gettysburg. And that's a supporting argument.
But maybe that's a distinction that should be made. It was a turning point in the East.
Mm-hmm. And I've always heard it said the war was won in the West. The East was a stalemate.
Yeah. But in the East, as far as the question of, is Lee going to be able to invade a true northern state? Gettysburg answered that question finally. He attempted to do it in September of 62 and was checked at Sharpsburg. And so he tries to do it again in July of 63, and he can't. And then from that moment on, like the best they could do is and he's not even making these incursions into Maryland with the full army. He's sending a portion of the army up there, which is, maybe more of a raid or something like that. So, I mean, I've heard that argument made before, and
it's the nature of the animal. Also, bear in mind that Lee was not invading the North to take and hold territory.
Right.
He's looking for a psychological, political victory.
Right.
And that's why I argued the North needed that 3-to-1 manpower issue, because they had to take the South and occupy it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they need that heavier every preponderance of strength. Someone last week argued, what if Lee had won Gettysburg? The war would have been over. I said, no, they got a whole nother army in Washington with the biggest defenses in the Western continent.
Yeah.
It would have been like Hannibal in the wars with Rome. Hannibal beat the Romans in every battle. He couldn't take Rome because he didn't have the siege machinery or the techniques to take a major fortified city.
Right.
So Lee was hoping for a political psychological win. One of the games I designed way back when was called The Great Invasion. And it was cool for its time. It's in Abstract Hall of Fame now. It was an area movement game with hidden movement. But before the Confederate player starts, he has to declare what is his purpose. Military victory, what I call milk and money, invade the Cumberland Valley and get all the supplies and cattle you can and go back home, or win political victory. And based on which of the three goals the Confederate player has, he gets different victory points for either killing Union troops or occupying land or picking up, building money. That's why I argue that Lee won the Antietam campaign before the battle. He captured all those troops and cannons and supplies at Harper's Ferry.
Yeah.
He was happy to go home. Why he stayed to fight at Antietam, I don't know.
Ego.
I guess he tried to read, ego, just like, why did he try Pickett's charge? People asking, well, this is the same Lee that had a worse charge at Malvern Hill exactly a year before, and we don't talk about that.
Right,
we only
right.
talk about Pickett's charge or Longstreet's assault or whatever.
Well, and the other thing to this question of what if they had won the Battle of Gettysburg, that doesn't mean that the Union Army was necessarily or would have necessarily been annihilated. They could have just
what I argued last week. Yeah,
they could have just redeployed, and then they had another fight that the Union could have won. So
they both had heavy losses in terms of leaders and men. A major problem was Lee shot all his artillery ammunition before Pickett's charge. All they had left was canister.
Mm-hmm.
And that would have been, he was waiting there, hoping the Union would counterattack. Because even though his cannons had no long-range ammo left, they were still full of canister.
Right.
But he did not have enough ammunition for another battle. And people don't consider that. So even if he had technically won, yeah, you're right. There was a whole Union Army down at Washington, 25th Corps, and a lot of the Union Army, like 6th Corps, wasn't engaged at all, would have been strong enough to try to block him somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is all that Union cavalry that ran around. You're familiar with John Inboden had that huge train of wounded and got hit in the Monterey Path by the Union cavalry that was running all over the place, just like in Appomattox campaign. The South had no counter to these strong Union cavalry divisions.
Right.
That's Stewart. So yes, if that's a neat what if they had physically won the battle or won the battle on the first day, Meade would have just withdrawn to Westminster, Maryland, and start all over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
those what ifs are always tough because Gettysburg didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't even meant to be according to the players, maybe according to fate or the universe, or if you want to get all hokey like that, you could say it was meant to be, but it wasn't meant to be. It happened because that's the way things played out, and no one knew what was going to come of it until it was done. And then after it's done, you got to keep going. And I think that's the thing we forget about is the pursuit, Meade's pursuit of Lee. Like, there's more battles to be fought before they get back into Virginia. So, it's fun to play that what if game, but it's always frustrating.
Well, I'll throw at you, and this is what I actually prefaced my talk last week with. What's the turning point of World War II?
Oh God, I'm not that up on World War II. I would say, where in the European theater?
Okay, that's a fair question because one of the people there said Midway. Yeah, Midway was the turning point, definitely in the Pacific War.
Right.
But where I'm headed for with that is from our Western perspective. D-Day's the turning point.
I was gonna say D-Day, but then I thought, well, maybe
according to the History Channel and everybody else, it's clearly Stalingrad, because Hitler burned out all his impetus and supplies and good troops, trying to take Stalingrad when he should have been moving on Moscow.
So if you zoom out you don't just look at the American perspective, and you look at the whole Eastern theater.
For all practical purposes, it's probably Stalingrad.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying from our perspective, and that's why I'm getting back to Gettysburg. From our perspective, we might look at D-Day as the turning point.
Sure.
Just as from a typical Northern veteran's viewpoint, it's Gettysburg.
Yeah.
Because that's what's closest to me and what I'm most associated with, rather than arguing, New Orleans or Atlanta or something that's far away and I've never been there.
But what about the Union soldiers who didn't fight at Gettysburg and they were out west? What would their turning point have been? What would they have said?
That's why I'm arguing it's got to be Atlanta, because you got Chickamauga staring at you there.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean Shiloh's basically barely a Union victory, and Alex not given enough credit for picking up Corinth, Mississippi, and all these railroad junctions out there, and then Grant's great campaign against Vicksburg, which was a smoothly run, defeating 2 Confederate armies, because there was Johnston had won at Jackson, and Grant wisely killed that before he went against Vicksburg. But if you're a soldier in the ranks out in the West, you're aware that you've got a huge supply line. If you're if you're at Chattanooga, which was back and forth for quite a while, that you have a supply line that goes all the way back to Nashville. But I go back and argue Atlanta again, because once Atlanta fell, then the South was in deep trouble. It got split into thirds, and that third was important. Like I argued that the Texas theater was not important.
Mm-hmm.
You only send so many cows across the Mississippi. But once the Carolinas and Virginia got cut off from the deep South, whatever supplies you were getting. Although I have read that when Lee's army was almost starving at Petersburg, there was lots of food in North Carolina, and Governor Vance refused to release it.
Right.
He said, only if I feed the North Carolina troops.
Yeah, right.
So
states' rights is still holding strong.
South side of states' rights, yeah.
Yeah. Which is funny. So back to what would the guys in the West have said? That is what you're saying. Your analysis says the turning point was. But like Gettysburg, do we have veterans 20 years later writing about or going back and giving speeches at a certain place saying this is where the war turned?
That, and you know which battlefield I think has the most Confederate regimental markers on it?
What?
Chickamauga.
Okay.
It's in our territory, and we won it.
Yeah.
There's a fair amount of markers for both sides at Shiloh. Most of the Antietam markers are the government ones that Carmen set up. They're not regimentals.
Right.
So the South favorite battle is Chickamauga. It's mid-war, and things were looking up then, although they promptly shot their wad at when Longstreet couldn't take Knoxville. Mm-hmm. You also get the hand-in-hand foot because you get the Union interior flotilla, the fleet, the gunboats that are so important at Fort Donelson and the other activities, and they phase out because there's no rivers, around Atlanta and Chattanooga to be working with. But that was a joint operations out there, and Grant made good use of it out in the West. But if you're a soldier out in the West, I know my great-grandfather was in the Union battery at Vicksburg.
Okay.
They're going to be delighted when they finally captured the battle captured Vicksburg after the first couple of attacks didn't work. And they spent the winter there. Well, Forrest was running around burning down everybody's supply dumps, but consolidating their hold on northern Alabama and Mississippi. And they probably felt the war was turning. I'm arguing against myself after Vicksburg, but then they ran into Chattanooga.
Yeah.
And Chattanooga was they won Chickamauga, and they not blew it at Chattanooga. That's an interesting thing to look at. But once Chattanooga fell, then I think the Northern soldiers are going to be feeling good at a turn. And once Chattanooga fall, late 63, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's their Western turning point, I guess, if you're a soldier in the ranks.
So that's what I say. I think that the people that say there are multiple turning points, I mean, think of any era of your own life. If I think of when I started doing this show to where it is now, there are moments that I can look back on and say, well, that was a turning point because that led to this. And it was something different than what I was aiming for. So, you know what I mean? It's a turning point to me is something where you turn and go obviously in a different direction. that may not have been intended, and helps to lead to the final
it's
result.
a turning point, but if you want to argue the turning point, and before I jump into that, it's right, because as I did with the World War II question, you got to look at the Pacific theater and the European theater.
Yeah.
There's different turning points in the East. I guess it is fair then to say there's a turning point for the West, and for the East will be different
Well, yeah, I mean,
in the Civil War.
looking at your chart here, you say it starts with Atlanta and it starts to go up, and then up to Nashville, and then you get into 65, and it looks like these are all These are all Eastern battles, right?
Yeah, I broke that chart down.
Yeah, you got Petersburg. Go ahead.
Audience, this is the plus minus chart on wins in that see what the Western end looks as compared to the Eastern end. Because again, East is basically a draw.
Yeah. Yeah.
Until Petersburg fell.
Until Petersburg. And then look, I'll show the audience in the video that's watching now. You can see there, like you see this line here. And that's Nashville, right? Yeah, Nashville to Petersburg, and then once Petersburg comes, the it just shoots up, and then the war ends. So it looks to me that like the turning point, at least in the East, is going to be Petersburg, not Gettysburg, because that's when Lee now is against the ropes, and it's just punch after punch after punch after punch, and Grant just keeps on going until it's over.
Yeah.
So,
and because he was permitted by Lincoln, because in '62 Lincoln would have fired him after Cold Harbor.
Yeah, I think you changed my mind, David. I think you convinced me that Gettysburg is not the turning point. It is a turning point.
And then that's why I say I'll buy into three. The spring '62 economic changes, Gettysburg for stopping that invasion, and then fall '64 for the political, economic, inflation, and military. And this is not saying, again, every point is a turn. I mean, you talked about life decisions. I trained to be a college teacher. It didn't happen.
Right.
So I'm a private high school teacher. But the upside of that is, if I was in college, there'd be pressure to publish. High school teachers not yet. I've written over 30 books because I have the time to do it.
Right. No pressure.
And do fun things like this. So there can be more than one turning point.
Sure.
And that boils down to, besides in high school, as I said with your essay, you're welcome to believe what you want to believe, support it with facts, also define your terms. And if you're doing an essay on an AP test, was Gettysburg the turning point of the war? You got to define what turning point is first.
Yeah.
And you say, is there one turning point? Or there's a series of major turning points, and maybe a consensus we're coming to is there was, 2 or 3 turning points, and Gettysburg may have been a military turning point, although that could be argued because the false linkage with Vicksburg, and that Atlanta seems to be a bigger one, more important wise. But we're going back to what is the perception of what happened, and the perception later is Gettysburg. And that's what got into the books, and that's what I hear on the History Channel back and forth.
Right, and that's
so didn't get any farther than their high school history class.
But that's so interesting because to the veterans, I guess, and again, because of proximity to major northern cities and railroads and make it accessible and everything, it becomes the big
a holy place.
Yeah, it becomes a sacred shrine. And, it's funny because now, I don't know, it was about almost probably 20 years ago, it seems now, that the Park Service here, when they, actually, what is it? In 2028, it'll be 20 years since the Visitor Center opened. And I remember when the Visitor Center was being talked about prior to it being opened, they were talking about the displays, the things that they would have on display and everything. And that when you go into the museum, it was going to start you at the colonial era and move you through to now, basically, or at least when the park history. And people were, oh, here we go, being browbeaten by slavery again, and this is a battlefield, it's not anything to do with slavery, and blah, 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 right? But the park's answer to that was, listen, out of all the Civil War sites that we have, this is probably the only one most Americans will ever visit. And so we need to put the battle in the context of the war,
Yep.
and we need to just tell the whole story. And Gettysburg is the illustrative moment of the war.
And I thought that, and that's a great perspective, Matt, that Gettysburg is the one battlefield people will visit either earlier or at all.
Ever.
And you need to reach them
Yeah.
by explaining it here because that's where they're coming to.
Exactly.
And that's what was going on in the 1870s and 80s when they're putting the monuments up.
That's what I'm saying.
We're commemorating our victory in the war through putting monuments up at Gettysburg.
So Gettysburg, even right after the battle with John Batchelder, Gettysburg is recognized as something important, and it is memorialized that way very soon after. And I think it's almost like I don't think anybody consciously said this, but it's like they said, well, we're going to need some place for people to come to tell the story of this war. So might as well be here. You know, I don't think they did that, but it seems that is just the subconscious of all the generations since the battle, like has just said, like, this is where it has to be. And that's what it is. And so, yeah, whether or not it's the turning point or the turning point, I don't think it is anymore. It's a turning point. It's a big turning point in the East, but it's not the turning point in the East.
Yep.
It's the turning point in 1863 for sure.
Okay. Well, you're a knowledgeable fellow. I appreciate your buying into my discussion. Like I say, I used to waffle back and forth whether spring 62 or summer 64 was the turning point. And I still, if we're going to have prefer one or the other. And that gets into, is it the event or what caused the event to be the turning point?
How do you mean?
Because New Orleans and Nashville fell, the South then did not have manufacturing capability or financial capability, but that took a little while to develop.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like saying Hitler's decision to declare war in the United States after Pearl Harbor when he didn't have to was the turning point of the war, because that made the war be different.
Right.
But I'm still, much as I like spring 62, I think as we're discussing, still summer 64 is just shouting at me that this is when the people that were there started feeling it.
Right. And to me, spring 62, at least in the East, is when things just start ramping up. You know, yeah. I mean, that's when the war is really, you know, because Lee's taking command in June, and now you got a real fighter. And that's where things start getting nastier. It was nasty from the get-go, but, you know, nastier. And then it just turns into complete hell in 64 and early 65. It really is. And when you look at it, this is the thing I love about this chart, is when you look at it like that, when you look at it on a graph, and then you put it in with all these numbers too. You know, to me, it looks like, when I look at the numbers here, we'll go with the sheer numbers, right? 1861, the U.S. has 200,000. Confederates have 120,000. So there's only 80,000 more in the U.S. armed services. But by 1865, you have 1.15 million in the U.S., 350,000 in the Confederates. Now you have your 3-to-1 odds. But what it says to me, when you put everything else together, and then when you think of all the stories of the personalities involved and the battles and everything, every time I approach this from whatever angle it is, to me, the war is that the United States takes a while to get its shit together, right? And it seems to be, that's our story with everything. I mean, going on right now is this the flooding down in Asheville and in Tennessee and, you know, North Carolina, Tennessee, that area there. And, you know, I'm seeing videos from people that are down there saying, you know, nobody's helping us. And, you know, when civilians try to go and help, they're told they're not allowed in. And we'll get there. You know, the federal government will get its act together and get down there and do what they need to do the right way. But we're always slow on the take. And to me, that's the story of the Civil War. If the North had gotten its head out of its ass right away, it would have won. But there is so much politicking going on.
The regular army was only like 12,000 men.
Right, regular army's 12,000 men. Like, you know, we're completely caught off guard, even though it was brewing for how long, right? Years. This is brewing. People are talking of war before the election, but the federal government doesn't get its act together and prepare, and they react. So they're spending the early parts of the war, most of the war, reacting and learning and building itself.
Well, like in World War I, the Germans knew they had 11 months or something till the United States got fully mobilized, and that's why they made their last big assault.
Yeah,
because they knew it would take us a while to mobilize, get troops over, and get them trained, and that's what happened.
yeah.
Once we got fully involved, there was the end of World War I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. At least that time we didn't send a whole bunch of troops over to kind of feel things out until we had everything ready to go back home. You know, we waited those 11 months. Yeah, it's fascinating. And with any event in human history or personal lives, you know, it never makes total sense when you're in it. And it finally does when you look back on it. And, you know, for us to sit and argue over these things is fun. But at the end of the day, these guys weren't thinking that, like you pointed out earlier. Like, they're not thinking, oh, we just had our turning point. You have no idea. You don't know what the turning point is until you get to the end.
Yeah, right.
So, well, I thought this was fascinating, and I'm sure the audience is going to love this because it makes them think. And
thank you. I'll be eager to hear any reactions you get to it. I know you have a website or Facebook or something to that, and I'm sure you do to your programs you do. But the main thing is to get people thinking there's more going on than regiments shooting at each other.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's nice to be able to interpret 150 years later. Living through it at the time, it would have been rough.
Yeah, it would have been. David Martin, thank you very much for your time and sharing this with us. And what do you want to do next?
Oh, I thought thoughts on the first day. We were talking about it. I said we could do a Gettysburg What If. Let's do first day, because people are becoming really interested in the first day. Again, going back to kind of shirking everything that we've been told is important, and people now discovering what they find important. I find that, you know, there's a lot of things. Meade is getting a new look. Even McClellan is getting a new look now. And the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg seems to be getting a new look. There's a lot more people, especially now that people are studying for the guide exam and they're really getting into things. I'm hearing a lot of these people saying, you know, the first day really gets short shrift. But, you know, it was horrible. Well, that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah.
The book in the first place. But yeah, I have thoughts on the first day or something like that, rather than, you know, who's shooting at whom.
Good.
But what's happening, and more into, you know, operational and I do that a lot with monuments. What did the generals know in their immediate purview, and how did they react to it?
Mm-hmm.
Especially once there's a command vacuum when Reynolds was killed.
Right.
It's an amazing study, and there's a lot of brave troops shedding blood there, just because you got a lot of veterans. Well, you got new troops in there too that are handing in. Anyway, the first day's always fascinated me.
So thoughts on the first day or something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Not a blow by blow, but your thoughts of highlights or whatever. Yeah. All right. That'll be good. I like that. That's it for us, though, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it made you think. Let us know if you have something you want us to do on the show. We'll try to get it done for you. That's it. Thank you for your continued support, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye. All right, we are done.
That was fun. Thank you. I'm sorry if I got a little repetitive or I had to circle back, but there were several ideas that I kept looking at from different angles.
Oh, yeah, no, that's fine. No, I love hearing people think out loud and go all around and everything, because it's interesting. It's interesting stuff. Like I said, these numbers and these graphs that you made,
I'm glad I thought to send it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I am too, because it really and I have them, so when I make the video, I can edit them in so people
Yeah.
can see them.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's visualizing it is. Now, where did you you start them at 0? Are these just arbitrary numbers?
Yeah, I mean, like when I was going to do the Detroit Tigers, +1 when they win, -1 if they lose.
Okay.
So I just went through selected major battles. Now, it would be interesting maybe to break that down into East and Western theaters, but you get a general feel for, how's the war going,
Mm-hmm.
as you would with the Detroit Tiger baseball season, which until this year wasn't very good. And you can just see that bottom out at Chancellorsville.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that it's not straight up after Gettysburg.
No.
It's not straight up till after Wilderness.
No, it's just a little
Relax.
inching up. Yeah. Well, and what's interesting though is that you have the whole Union cause or the whole Union effort here. It's not just Eastern Theater or Western.
Yeah.
It's both theaters, and that's good, because I'm always so into the Eastern Theater. I'm not thinking about the Western Theater that much.
There weren't many Confederate victories out west besides Chickamauga,
Right.
because it was too much ground for their small armies. And that classic book on my bookshelf, Braxton Bragg and the Causes of the Confederate Defeat, Volume 1. What if Lee had been in charge out in the West?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time to study, and I appreciate you liking to come on the show all the time, because I enjoy our conversations. And
Well, same here.
I'm
So
glad you
let's
like it.
do some email back and forth, I guess, to set up July 1, I had a list of dates. I could look at some more. I'm on a lot of flex time. I'm supposed to be writing a school history right now, and I think about it all the time, but I can only handle it 2 or 3 hours a day at a time, because I get it's hard to write about current events. It's a lot easier to write about things 100 years ago.
It's hard to be dispassionate when you're talking or writing about current events.
Yep.
Because obviously you're living through it, and you have opinions on what's right and what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And and you don't want to come off as biased. It's very hard. Even with historical stuff, I'm sure it's hard to not come off as biased. But
Well, yeah, I mean, my politics may show through both here and maybe even in the study of the war, but I'm more a pragmatist. I mean, I tell people, I was at a conference with Jim McPherson. By the way, it was Jim McPherson in his magnum opus on the war that talked about multiple turning points.
yeah,
I did remember that right. But how did Lincoln get the nomination? 2 reasons for presidency in 1860. 2 reasons. One, the Republican convention was in Chicago, his home base. If it had been in Philadelphia, I don't think he would have got it. Secondly, he's second on everybody's list. So when you have Stanton and Seward and Chase, their home states would vote for them, and then Lincoln second.
right.
And his workers were able to get him together. But that was sheer luck. Again, if that Republican convention in 1860 had been in Philadelphia, he wouldn't have got elected.
That's amazing. It's amazing how close we came to not, really. I think the country is, to this day, lucky that he was there at that time and he got into the White House.
Yeah, and I forget, it was on one of those talk stations. Somebody did a book on the best and the worst presidents, and they have Lincoln clearly the best.
Yeah.
Right man in the right place at the right time. It's like Washington was the right man
Right.
in the right place at the right time. And what's so great about Washington, other than being wouldn't admit defeat, was, and I do this at my talks to Monmouth all the time, he had no sons. So they did not have to worry about him setting up a dynasty. And the greatest thing he did, and the European kings recognized that, Napoleon did, that he gave up his power after 8 years.
Yeah.
Napoleon couldn't believe that.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we had a peaceable transition after that first presidency.
Yeah.
So that's why Lincoln and Washington are on Mount Rushmore.
Yeah, I mean, they set great examples. I mean, of course, they had their flaws, but find me one man who doesn't.
Yeah, we all do.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I don't, but everybody else does. All right, I got to get going.
Yeah.
It was great talking to you.
Thank you. I'm glad I overcame my crisis when I sat down in my other office and said, sorry, no camera.
Yeah, make sure you get a camera in your office.
Could have been done without the face-to-face. So, shoot another set of dates at me, and I'll throw a few notes together on, thoughts on the first day.
Will do. Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, lunchtime.
All right.
Okay, see you.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. Thank you guys who are still watching. I appreciate it. Any questions, anything like that? Probably not, right? Okay. I left the meeting. All right. I got to go stop the video. So I will see you next time. I think I have another recording. Oh no, I have to go get a procedure done tomorrow, so I will not be recording for 2 days. And then we have some Ask a Guides that I need questions for, and I think, no, I put that out. So, all right, that's it. Whatever. Have a great Monday.